Hello, and welcome to the Unseen Question. History is full of examples showing how the threat of eternal punishment has been woven into politics, law, and everyday life. In medieval Europe, for instance, the Church's authority was reinforced by the idea that disobedience wasn't just a civic offense. It was a spiritual one with eternal stakes. Questioning certain doctrines wasn't merely heresy in the legal sense, it was framed as an act that could condemn your soul forever. That framing made dissent not just dangerous, but morally unthinkable for most people. The Spanish Inquisition is one of the most infamous examples. While its official purpose was to root out heresy, the real power came from fear. The idea wasn't just that you could be punished in this life, but that you could be sealing your fate for all eternity. That double layer of threat, temporal and infinite, created a level of compliance that raw political power alone could never achieve. And it wasn't only in Europe. In various religious traditions across the world, eternal punishment or its equivalent has been used to maintain social order. Sometimes the imagery differs. Fire in one place, ice or darkness in another, but the function remains the same. It's a story designed to make the cost of disobedience unimaginably high, so high that rational risk-taking disappears. In modern times, even in largely secular countries, traces of this thinking persist. People who no longer believe in eternal punishment often still carry what's sometimes called residual guilt. It's the leftover emotional reflex from years of hearing that certain thoughts, doubts, or desires could lead to cosmic disaster. They may know intellectually that the threat is gone, but emotionally, the old fear still stirs. Psychologists have studied similar patterns in people who leave high-control groups or cults. The fear doesn't vanish overnight. It can resurface in moments of stress or uncertainty, like a ghost of the old belief. This shows how deeply the idea of eternal punishment can embed itself in the human mind. It's not just a belief, it's a mental habit, and habits that shape our deepest fears are the hardest to break. The influence also shows up in politics and law. In some countries, arguments against progressive policies still lean, even subtly, on the language of eternal reward and punishment. The notion that moral failings must be punished harshly rather than understood or rehabilitated often has roots in this old religious mindset. Even when the theology is stripped away, the structure of thought remains. There's an irony here. While eternal punishment is framed as the ultimate justice, it often blocks actual justice in the real world. It shifts focus away from solving problems here and now because the ultimate reckoning is imagined to happen elsewhere. If someone is wronged, the response can be, they'll get what they deserve in the afterlife, which is an excuse to do nothing in the present. It's a moral deferral, and it leaves real harm unaddressed. On a personal level, the belief can also cause people to accept suffering as deserved. If someone thinks misfortune is a sign of moral failure, maybe even a hint of future eternal punishment, they may accept it without protest. They may even see helping others as interfering with divine justice. That's how a dangerous idea quietly erodes empathy in day-to-day life. Some defenders of the doctrine argue that without the threat of eternal punishment, morality would collapse, but studies on non-religious populations show otherwise. Societies with little to no belief in eternal punishment, like some of the Nordic countries, consistently rank among the highest in measures of trust, equality, and quality of life. This suggests that morality doesn't need the shadow of infinity to function. It needs empathy, fairness, and mutual accountability, all of which are possible without fear of cosmic torture. One angle that doesn't get enough attention is how the concept of eternal punishment actually undermines moral responsibility rather than reinforcing it. When every wrong act is punished infinitely, there's no real distinction between mistakes. In such a system, stealing a piece of bread and committing mass murder are placed on the same eternal scale. That flattening of morality doesn't elevate ethics. It distorts them. If the smallest slip is treated as equal to the greatest harm, then morality stops being about the actual consequences of our actions. It becomes about compliance with a set of rules, no matter how arbitrary those rules might be. People are judged not by how they treat others, but by whether they've satisfied the conditions that supposedly shield them from punishment. This encourages a kind of checklist morality. one where the focus is on personal safety from judgment rather than on the well-being of others. And there's something else here. The logic of infinite punishment assumes that people are fully free to choose their beliefs and actions, and that those choices are made in a vacuum. But human life doesn't work like that. People are shaped by their environment, education, mental health, and the information available to them. To say that someone chose wrongly without factoring in these influences is to ignore how human decision-making actually works. This is where the doctrine of eternal punishment starts to look less like a moral truth and more like a human invention born out of insecurity. If you can't persuade people with reason, compassion, or example, you might turn to fear. And if you want that fear to be inescapable, you make the threat infinite. It's the ultimate leverage. You can't negotiate with it, you can't serve your time and walk free. It's permanent. That permanence is key to its psychological power. We can endure hardship when we believe it will end. Even the thought of decades in prison is different from the thought of never ever getting out. Infinity strips away hope entirely, and without hope, fear becomes the dominant force. This raises another problem. If the purpose of punishment is reform, eternal punishment makes that impossible. Reform requires change, and change requires time. But in a state of infinite suffering, there's no chance for learning, no moment for redemption. That means the punishment isn't about improvement at all. It's about retribution, pure and unending. And if retribution is endless, it ceases to be about the offense and becomes about the punisher. It tells us more about their character than about the crime. In human terms, if someone inflicted pain forever, we'd call them cruel, no matter what justification they offered. Yet when this is placed in a religious framework, many feel compelled to call it just. There's a strange contradiction in how some believers reconcile this. They'll say that the punished have chosen their fate, and that the door to mercy was always open. But if the choice is made under the looming threat of infinite harm, then it's not really a free choice at all. And if the door is truly open, why would it close forever after death? Why wouldn't an infinitely merciful being allow for change at any point, even a billion years into the future? The more you think about it, the more it becomes clear that eternal punishment is not a concept built on justice, but on finality. It's about making sure the story ends in one place and never moves again. And in that sense, it says more about human fear of uncertainty than about any higher truth. When you first hear about the concept of eternal punishment, it sounds like something pulled straight from the imagination of a storyteller who never learned how to end a tale. The idea is simple on the surface. Live in a certain way, believe certain things, and you'll avoid an infinite sentence of suffering. Fail, and you'll be subjected to pain without end. It's a concept so extreme that if it were about anything other than religion, we'd reject it outright. If a government today proposed infinite prison sentences for minor offenses, let alone for thought crimes, people would call it barbaric. Yet somehow, when it's packaged in religious language, it's presented not only as acceptable but as moral. The first problem is proportion. Punishment, in any ethical framework we apply in real life, is tied to the scale of the wrongdoing. Even the harshest justice systems operate on the idea that the penalty should match the crime. But infinite punishment, that's not justice. It's the abandonment of justice entirely. No human action, no finite moment in a finite life could possibly justify infinite suffering. Defenders of the idea often claim it's about divine justice, not human justice. But if we strip away the mystical framing and evaluate it by the same reasoning we use in every other moral question, it collapses. What they're really saying is that the most extreme punishment imaginable should be applied not just for actions, but for beliefs, or the lack of certain beliefs. That's a system that rewards obedience over morality, fear over reason. It's also worth asking why an all-powerful, all-knowing being would design a system where eternal punishment is even possible. If the point is moral growth, then infinite punishment ensures there's never any growth. The person suffering learns nothing after the first second. The rest is pure waste, eternal, conscious, useless waste. Some argue that the punishment is self-inflicted, that people choose separation or torment by rejecting a god. But that's a strange definition of choice. If someone refuses to swear loyalty under the threat of torture, that's not choice, that's coercion. In human terms, we'd call it extortion. Yet when this same logic is placed in a theological setting, it's dressed up as freedom. Psychologically, the idea of infinite punishment is also corrosive. It trains the mind to accept fear as a virtue. It tells people to distrust their own moral compass, to feel guilty for doubts, and to see honest questioning as dangerous. This can have long-term effects, even for those who later leave the belief behind. A fear planted deep enough can echo in the mind for years. Historically, the threat of eternal punishment has been a powerful tool for control. In times when literacy was rare and information was tightly controlled, this fear ensured obedience. If the penalty for disobedience isn't a fine or imprisonment, but unending agony, there's no limit to what people will accept in the hope of avoiding it. Wars have been fought, dissent silenced, and entire populations kept in line under this shadow. There's also a strange double standard. Many believers will insist that their God is infinitely loving and infinitely merciful. Yet this same God is willing to condemn people to infinite suffering for finite mistakes. If we applied that reasoning to any human leader, we'd call them a tyrant without hesitation. The idea that mercy and infinite punishment can coexist is a contradiction so glaring it only survives when shielded from scrutiny. The moral contradiction deepens when you consider the common teaching that the saved will feel no sorrow for the damned, that somehow those in paradise will be at peace knowing others are suffering forever. If true, it means the very capacity for empathy has to be stripped away in order to enjoy heaven. And if empathy is removed, what kind of paradise is left? One built on detachment from suffering, not the end of suffering. There's a deeper psychological cost to all this. When you grow up hearing that even small failures could lead to eternal consequences, you're being conditioned into a constant state of moral panic. Every decision becomes loaded with cosmic weight. Every doubt feels like walking toward a cliff. This kind of thinking narrows a person's mental world until it's ruled not by curiosity or compassion, but by the fear of crossing invisible lines. For children, especially, the concept of eternal punishment can be devastating. Their developing minds are still forming a sense of right and wrong. If their earliest moral lessons are tied to infinite consequences, it doesn't teach them to think critically about ethics. It teaches them to obey without question. That's not morality, that's conditioning. And conditioning through fear doesn't create healthier societies. It creates more fragile ones. In everyday life, we understand that fear distorts judgment. We know that threats can make people act against their own conscience. Yet in religious systems that include eternal punishment, fear isn't a flaw. It's the engine. Without that fear, many of the rituals, the rules, the unquestioning loyalty would lose their grip. Which raises the question, if a moral system can't stand without fear, how strong is it really? There's also an issue of fairness when you think globally. Billions of people live and die without ever hearing the specific version of belief required to avoid eternal punishment in one religion or another. If the rules are unclear, inconsistent, or unreachable for most of humanity, then the whole setup starts to look like a rigged game. One where the outcome was decided long before the player even got a chance to start. And this isn't just a modern observation. Throughout history, philosophers, skeptics, and even some theologians have wrestled with the problem. If the divine goal is love or justice, then the existence of eternal punishment makes no sense. If the goal is control, however, it makes perfect sense. It's the ultimate deterrent, one that can't be escaped, appealed, or overturned. Even the imagery tied to eternal punishment tells us something about its origins. In many traditions, descriptions of hell resemble the punishments familiar to the cultures where the stories developed: fire, chains, darkness, endless labor. It's not evidence of divine reality, but of human imagination drawing from human fears. The afterlife becomes an exaggerated reflection of earthly cruelty, scaled up to infinity. Some defenders try to soften the concept, saying the punishment is metaphorical or symbolic. But if it's symbolic, then the fear it inspires is based on a misunderstanding. And if religious leaders knowingly use terrifying metaphors to scare people into compliance, then it's not moral guidance, it's manipulation. There's also a strange economic aspect to it. In systems where eternal punishment is emphasized, forgiveness often comes with conditions, rituals, payments, acts of service, or loyalty to an institution. In practice, it creates a dependency. People live under a constant cycle of fear, failure, and seeking relief from the very authority that defined the danger in the first place. It's a self-perpetuating loop, and a profitable one for those in power. When you strip away the theological wrapping, the idea of infinite punishment becomes almost cartoonish in its extremity. Not because suffering isn't real, but because infinity is so far beyond our moral and emotional frameworks that it can't be justified. In human terms, there is nothing more absurd than the idea of endless conscious torment for mistakes made in a short, fragile lifetime. What's more, our understanding of human behavior shows that people are not shaped in a vacuum. Choices are influenced by genetics, upbringing, culture, and circumstances beyond their control. If these factors are real, and mountains of research say they are, then the notion of holding someone infinitely accountable for finite actions they were shaped into making isn't just unjust, it's irrational. Even in cultures where belief in a literal hell has faded, the structure of the idea still lingers. You can see it in moral absolutism, the tendency to see people as entirely good or entirely evil, with no room for complexity. That's essentially a social version of eternal punishment. You're either in or out, worthy or unworthy, forever defined by a single category. It shows up in how we talk about justice, too. The impulse to permanently cancel someone, to brand them for life over even a minor offense, has echoes of that same binary thinking. It's the cultural residue of a worldview where redemption is often an all-or-nothing proposition. While the language has changed, the underlying psychology isn't entirely gone. Part of the reason the concept survives is that it's adaptable. Religious authorities can soften it when needed, presenting it more as separation than torment, or as a symbolic state rather than a literal place. But the emotional weight remains. Whether it's fire and brimstone or vague spiritual exile, the core message is the same. Step out of line in the wrong way and the consequence is total and permanent. Another reason is that fear is a stubborn motivator. Even if the belief weakens, people often carry a just-in-case attitude, a kind of Pascal's wager instinct. The thought is better to believe and be wrong than to disbelieve and be wrong. But this kind of thinking doesn't actually solve the problem, it only postpones it. Living under the shadow of a possibility, no matter how unlikely, still shapes choices and limits freedom. What's striking is how unnecessary it all is. You don't need an infinite punishment to have moral order. In fact, many of the world's most cooperative and peaceful communities operate without it. They rely instead on empathy, reciprocity, and mutual interest, principles that have been observed not just in humans, but in other social animals. These systems aren't perfect, but they're grounded in realities we can see, measure, and improve. When morality is tied to fear of eternal consequences, it becomes fragile. It depends on people continuing to believe in something unverifiable. Take away that belief, and the structure can collapse overnight. But when morality is tied to shared well-being and tangible outcomes, it doesn't require belief in an unseen threat. It survives because it works here and now. This is perhaps the biggest weakness of the doctrine. It's not self-sustaining without faith in the unseen. And faith, by its nature, can fade. Once people begin to ask whether eternal punishment makes sense, they often find that the answer, even within the theological framework, is not as clear as they've been told. From there, the fear starts to loosen its grip. But loosening that grip isn't just an intellectual process. It's emotional, too. For many, shedding the fear of eternal punishment feels like peeling away a part of themselves. It's not easy to let go of something you've been told is the foundation of morality. Yet those who do often describe a profound shift. They start making choices based on values they can defend, rather than threats they can't verify. The idea of infinite punishment has always claimed to be about ultimate justice. But when you strip away the mystique, what's left is a vision of reality where compassion ends at the grave, and where learning and change have no place beyond a certain point. It's a view that doesn't match what we know about growth, forgiveness, or the complexity of human life. In our lived experience, we know people can change. We've seen individuals who've caused great harm take responsibility, make amends, and rebuild trust. We've seen others turn their lives around after decades of destructive behavior. If change is real in this life, why would it be impossible in the next? An eternal sentence denies the very possibility of transformation. It assumes that who you are at the moment of death is who you are forever. From a philosophical standpoint, the idea also raises questions about the nature of morality. If the reason to do good is to avoid pain or gain reward, is that really morality or just self-preservation? Genuine morality doesn't need an infinite stick or carrot. It's about valuing others, respecting fairness, and living in a way that reduces harm because it's right, not because you're afraid. There's also the issue of proportionality. The human mind can barely comprehend infinity. We can imagine large numbers, but infinity is beyond any scale we can grasp. When a punishment is infinite, it's not just excessive, it becomes meaningless as a moral tool. It can't be measured, it can't be compared, and it offers no feedback loop for better behavior. It's a concept that breaks the very logic of justice. Even if someone believed in a higher power, they'd still have to wrestle with what infinite punishment says about that power's character. Mercy that ends the moment you stop breathing isn't infinite mercy. Justice that ignores the scale of the offense isn't justice. And love that allows for endless agony without hope of reconciliation isn't love. Some may still argue that eternal punishment is simply the rules, and that questioning them is irrelevant. But accepting a rule without questioning its morality is the first step towards surrendering your own moral judgment. It's in the act of questioning, of weighing ideas against reason, evidence, and empathy, that we keep morality alive and human. And that's why the concept matters even to those who don't believe it literally. Because as long as the idea exists, it shapes laws, cultures, and personal relationships. It teaches some to obey blindly, others to condemn without compassion, and many to live with a fear they can't fully name. That fear can silence important conversations, keep people trapped in harmful situations, and distort the way we see one another. The truth is, we don't need eternal punishment to live meaningful, ethical lives. We can hold people accountable in ways that allow for repair. We can protect each other without threatening each other with infinity. We can face the reality that life is finite, and see that as a reason to treat each other better now, rather than gambling on rewards or punishments later. If there is any eternal worth striving for, it's not an endless sentence of pain, but the lasting impact of kindness, fairness, and truth. Those are the things that ripple outward beyond our own lifetimes. They're not enforced by fear, and they don't depend on unseen courts. They're built in the here and now, and they remain long after fear has lost its power. So the hellish truth about infinite punishment is this: it's not a moral necessity. It's a human construct, a tool of control disguised as cosmic law. And the moment we see it for what it is, we take away the only power it ever truly had, the power to keep us afraid.